He abandoned his pregnant wife to marry his mistress, unaware of the life-altering events that awaited him. Dive into this story to uncover the consequences of his decisions. Richard Bennett sat in his wide leather armchair in his office, overlooking the New York City skyline. The room, adorned with expensive art pieces and exclusive designer furniture, seemed to perfectly reflect his success. But at that moment, the expression on his face suggested anything but satisfaction. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, lost in thought. "You can't do this to me, Richard," Emily shouted, her voice broken with despair. She stood on the other side of the desk, her silhouette illuminated by the twilight streaming through the massive windows. Her hair, usually neatly styled, was disheveled, and her eyes were swollen from crying. "Emily, I've already made my decision," Richard replied, his voice cold as the marble floor beneath his feet. He avoided looking directly at her, focusing instead on the amber liquid in his glass. "We have nothing in common anymore. I can't keep pretending. You're going to abandon us?" "I'm pregnant, Richard," she pleaded, her hands instinctively protecting her belly. "After everything we've built together?" "Built?" He finally looked at her, and the sarcasm in his voice cut like a knife. "I built this. I worked hard while you stayed at home." Emily stepped back, as if she'd been physically struck. "Stayed at home? Do you really think creating a home, taking care of you, and supporting your dreams isn't work?" Richard sighed, irritated. "It doesn't matter anymore. I want something different now. I want Vanessa." The mention of his secretary's name made Emily's blood run cold. Vanessa, Richard's young and ambitious personal assistant, was everything Emily wasn't at that moment. Confident, glamorous, and above all, unburdened by pregnancy. "Vanessa?" she repeated, incredulous. "You're leaving your family for a girl who's only with you for your money? You're being ridiculous, Emily. Vanessa understands me in a way you never did." Emily felt a lump in her throat, but refused to let the tears fall. "And the baby, Richard? Our child? Are you going to turn your back on him, too?" "I'll take care of the expenses," he replied hastily. "You'll have everything you need, but don't expect me to be part of it. I can't continue this charade." She was silent for a moment, trying to process what he had just said. "You're leaving me with nothing, not just financially, but emotionally. You're abandoning us." Richard downed the rest of his whiskey in one gulp, avoiding the pain in her eyes. "I've already made my decision." Emily stared at him, her voice low but firm. "You may have made your decision, but one day you'll regret this, Richard. Mark my words." Emily collapsed onto the floor in tears. The future she had envisioned shattered before her eyes, and she felt completely lost. Later that night, as Richard left the house, driving to the apartment he would now share with Vanessa, he didn't look back. For him, it was the beginning of a new life. For Emily, it was the start of a battle to rebuild hers. Emily felt the weight of the world on her shoulders as she left the house she had once called home. Every step seemed harder than the last, but something inside her, a nearly extinguished spark, kept pushing her forward. She carried a small suitcase in one hand and a folder of documents in the other, her heart torn between pain and determination to survive. With virtually no support from Richard, she temporarily stayed at the house of a childhood friend, Rachel, who welcomed her without hesitation. It was their friendship that helped Emily endure the first days when everything felt lost. "You have every right to feel devastated, Emily," Rachel said one evening while serving hot tea. "But you also have the right to start over. Richard may have taken a lot from you, but he will never take your ability to fight." Those words echoed in Emily's mind. Between tears and sleepless nights, she began to craft a plan. The baby she carried became her greatest reason to keep going. It wouldn't be easy, but Emily promised herself she would give him a decent life, no matter the circumstances. In the following months, Emily began to rebuild her life little by little. She looked for a job and, despite years away from the workforce, secured a position as an administrative assistant at a small marketing company. The salary was modest, but enough to start with. During the day, she worked diligently, absorbing everything she could about her new field. At night, she dedicated herself to studying and improving her qualifications while managing the challenges of pregnancy. The transition was difficult. Many times, Emily found herself staring out of the bus window, imagining how her life might have been if Richard had chosen to support her instead of abandoning her. But she quickly pushed those thoughts away. Every small progress felt like a victory, and she learned to celebrate those moments. One Saturday afternoon, while walking through a park, Emily felt the baby's first kick. It was as if he was saying, "I'm here with you, Mom." She smiled for the first time in weeks, feeling a renewed strength. That moment marked the beginning of a new phase. Soon after, Emily managed to rent a small apartment with the money she had saved. It wasn't big or luxurious, but it was a place where she could finally start building her new life. She carefully decorated the space, choosing simple furniture and items that brought warmth to the environment. Every detail was chosen with the baby's future in mind. As months passed, Emily began to make connections at work. A colleague, Tom, became an important mentor, helping her develop skills and introducing her to valuable contacts in the industry. Tom was a kind and intelligent man who recognized Emily's determination and constantly encouraged her. "You have a natural talent for this, Emily," he said one day after a successful presentation. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words fueled her confidence. Emily began to see a promising future, not just for herself, but also for the child she was about to bring into the world. The day of the birth marked a milestone in her journey. Without Richard's presence, after hours of labor, Emily gave birth to a healthy baby boy she named Ethan. When she held the baby for the first time, tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't of sadness. They were of pure love and the certainty that, despite everything, she was exactly where she needed to be. As she looked at Ethan, Emily felt an even greater determination to succeed. The battle was far from over, but now she had a clear purpose. Richard may have chosen to abandon his family, but she chose to fight, and that choice would guide her in the years to come. Richard Bennett still had a life that to others seemed flawless. The luxurious penthouse, the sports cars, the social events attended by important personalities. But inside, he carried a growing emptiness, something even he couldn't fully understand. Vanessa, the woman for whom he had abandoned Emily and their child, was still by his side. However, the sparks that once united them seemed to have faded. Vanessa displayed increasingly distant behavior, preoccupied with her own ambitions and a schedule that Richard no longer seemed to share. He was beginning to notice how much more interested she was in appearances than in genuine connections. One night, Richard woke in the middle of the night, his mind restless. He got up, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and sat in his favorite armchair, staring out at the city lights. A troubling thought consumed him. What if he had made all the wrong choices? He reflected on Emily and the son he had never met. The thought that he had abandoned his family to chase something that now felt meaningless tormented him. But he pushed the idea away, blaming it on the momentary weight of the night and the drink. The next morning, Vanessa rushed out for yet another meeting. "Don't wait for me for dinner," she said, leaving without even looking at him. Richard watched the door close and for the first time felt like a stranger in his own home. At work, things weren't going well either. A series of failed negotiations and investors' mistrust were beginning to affect Richard's reputation. He noticed that the people who once sought him out with admiration now avoided him in silence. It was as if the glow that surrounded him had vanished. During a board meeting, Henry Wallace, his longtime business partner and friend, was more assertive than usual. "We need to adjust our strategies. We're losing ground in the trust of our key partners." Richard sensed Henry's almost authoritarian tone, but chose to ignore it. "We're going through a rough patch, but everything will be resolved. I know what I'm doing." Henry raised his eyebrows, but didn't argue. Richard, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping out of his control. One evening, Richard decided to attend a charity dinner. Vanessa was traveling, and he thought it would be good to distract himself. At the event, he met old acquaintances and tried to rekindle some connections, but he realized that the conversations were superficial and full of formalities. People treated him with distant cordiality, as if he were a faded reflection of the man he used to be. Back at his house, Richard couldn't sleep. He took out an old photo of Emily that he had kept and lost himself in memories of what could have been. For the first time, he admitted to himself that his life wasn't what he had hoped for. The emptiness he felt seemed to grow with each passing day. He began to question the choices that had brought him to this point, but he knew it would take more than regret to change the course of his story. However, he wasn't yet ready to face all the truths. Years had passed since the night Emily Bennett collapsed in tears on the cold floor of her former home. Now, she was a completely transformed woman. The fragile Emily, who had been abandoned by Richard, had become a successful businesswoman and a proud mother. Ethan, the baby she carried at the time, was now a brilliant young man, studying at one of the best universities in the country. They lived in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, in a house that looked like it came straight out of a design magazine. Everything about it reflected her dedication and resilience. However, what truly made that home special was the family dynamic. Emily had found love again with Michael, a kind and reliable man who entered her life a few years after her separation from Richard. Michael not only loved her deeply, but also took on the role of father to Ethan, building a bond so strong it often felt as though they had always been a family. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and Emily was preparing breakfast while Michael read the newspaper in the living room. Ethan came down the stairs with a lazy smile, still wearing an old t-shirt. "Good morning, Mom." "Good morning, Dad," he said, sitting at the table. Michael smiled and ruffled Ethan's hair. "Good morning, champ. Ready for practice today?" Ethan was part of his university's debate team and was preparing for a national competition. Emily looked at him with pride. "You're going to do great, as always. Do you need anything? Should I pack something for you to eat later?" "I'm fine, Mom. Thanks," he replied, pouring himself a glass of juice. "I'm a little late, though." Emily smiled. She knew the journey to this point hadn't been easy, but every moment of Ethan's triumph made it all worthwhile. He was a reflection of everything she had fought to achieve. Later that day, Emily attended a meeting at her company, which had grown from a small business into a leader in the digital marketing industry. During the meeting, she presented an innovative campaign that drew praise from the entire team. But as everyone celebrated, Emily received an unexpected email, an invitation to a business award ceremony. Richard Bennett's name appeared on the guest list. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but quickly composed herself. She hadn't seen Richard since he had abandoned her. As much as his name brought back painful memories, she knew she was no longer the vulnerable woman from 18 years ago. Now, she had a full life and plenty to show for it. That evening, during dinner with her family, Emily decided to share the news. "I've been invited to a business event next week," she began in a casual tone. "It seems Richard will be there." Michael raised an eyebrow. "And how do you feel about that?" Emily shrugged. "Indifferent, honestly. For a long time, I fought for him to take responsibility for his son, to cover expenses, but he was too powerful. I won't let his presence change who I am or what I've achieved." Ethan looked at his mother with curiosity. "I never met him. I don't even miss him. Do you think he'll try to talk to you?" "I don't know, son," Emily replied calmly. "But if he does, I'm ready for it." Michael placed his hand over hers, offering silent support. "We'll be here for you, as always." The week passed quickly, and the day of the event arrived. Emily wore an elegant black dress and a discreet yet sophisticated necklace. She was impeccable, exuding confidence. Upon arriving at the venue, she was greeted warmly by other business leaders. While chatting with colleagues, her eyes caught a familiar figure in the corner of the room. Richard was there, but he looked like a shadow of the man she had once known. His suit, although well-fitted, couldn't hide the tired expression and the traces of regret on his face. Emily noticed that he had seen her. Their eyes briefly met before she turned her attention back to the conversation she was having. Richard, on the other hand, couldn't look away. He watched Emily, impressed by the woman she had become. Everything about her radiated success and confidence, while he felt the weight of his wrong choices. At the end of the night, Emily picked up her bag to leave. As she walked toward the exit, Richard hesitated before approaching her. "Emily," he began, his voice low. She stopped and looked at him, standing firm. "Richard, it's been a long time." He swallowed hard. "You look amazing. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Emily tilted her head slightly, assessing him. "Thank you, Richard. I hope you found what you were looking for." "And our son?" Richard asked, almost whispering. "Is he ours now?" "A little late to care, don't you think?" He lowered his eyes, unable to hold her gaze. "I ruined everything, didn't I?" "Yes, you did," Emily replied, not with anger but with cutting honesty. "But it doesn't matter anymore. I moved on, and my life is better because of it." She gave him a small smile and walked out, where Michael was waiting for her in the car. As she got in, she felt a peace she had never experienced before. She knew she had closed an important chapter of her life. As the car drove away, Richard stood there, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. He knew he had lost something irreplaceable. The days following the event deeply affected Richard. He couldn't forget Emily's confident gaze or the firmness in her words. For the first time in years, he felt the real weight of the choices that had brought him to this point. Meanwhile, Emily continued with her life, but knew that the unexpected encounter could bring consequences. One afternoon, while Emily was reviewing documents in her office, she received an unexpected call. It was Richard. Seeing his name on the screen brought a mix of surprise and distrust. "Emily, please don't hang up. I just want a chance to talk to you," he said, his voice filled with hesitation. "Richard, there's nothing more to be said," Emily replied, keeping her calm. I know, he sighed. "But what about Ethan? I'd like to meet him if he allows it." Emily was silent for a moment. "That's not up to me, Richard. It's his decision. But I must warn you, he has no bond with you." "I understand," Richard said, almost whispering, "but I need to try." That evening, Emily decided to talk to Ethan, sitting at the kitchen table. She explained the situation clearly. "Your biological father wants to meet you," she said, watching her son's reaction closely. Ethan thought for a few moments before responding. "Mom, he's never been more than a name to me. Michael is my dad. But if you think it's important, maybe I should hear what he has to say." Emily held his hand, proud of his maturity. "This is your decision, Ethan. Whatever it is, Michael and I will stand by you." The meeting between Ethan and Richard was set for the following weekend at a discreet cafe in the city. Richard arrived early, visibly nervous. When Ethan entered, accompanied by Michael, Richard felt a mix of anxiety and regret. "Ethan," Richard began, standing up, "thank you for coming." Ethan simply nodded, maintaining a reserved demeanor. They sat down and Richard tried to start the conversation. I know I don't deserve your time, but I want you to know how deeply I regret what happened." "You weren't there when I needed you," Ethan said, looking directly at Richard. "You weren't there for my mom. Why do you think you deserve to be here now?" Richard swallowed hard. "I don't have a good answer. All I can say is that I was wrong, and I want to make up for it in any way I can." Michael remained silent, observing. He knew this was Ethan's moment, but his presence was a reminder that the young man had never been alone. When the meeting ended, Ethan left the cafe feeling a mix of relief and confusion. On one hand, confronting Richard had lifted a weight off his shoulders. On the other, he wasn't sure what to do with the conflicting emotions that surfaced. Richard, meanwhile, stayed seated for a few minutes, contemplating the void his absence had left in his son's life. Despite the discomfort, both knew this was just the beginning of a conversation that needed to happen. In the days that followed, Ethan decided to maintain limited contact with Richard. Although he didn't consider him a father, he felt there was something to gain in understanding the man who had abandoned him. Their conversations were revealing, with Richard sharing his struggles and regrets. Ethan, in turn, showed the strength and values he had inherited from Emily and Michael. Meanwhile, Emily dealt with her own reflections. The reunion brought old feelings to the surface, but it also reinforced her certainty that her current life was everything she needed. Michael, ever present, supported her every step of the way, showing that true love is built with actions, not just words. After a few weeks, Richard requested one final meeting with Emily and Ethan together. He wanted to close the chapter with a note of sincerity. During the meeting, held at Emily's home, Richard looked at the two of them with tear-filled eyes. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I want to make sure you know how deeply I regret and respect everything you've built. Ethan, you're an incredible young man. Emily, you're the strongest woman I've ever known." Emily responded with a serene smile. "Thank you, Richard. I hope this reunion has brought some purpose to you as well." As he left, Richard felt a mix of sadness and acceptance. He finally understood that some losses are permanent, but he also recognized the power of forgiveness and new beginnings. For Emily and Ethan, his presence was no longer a shadow but merely a memory that reinforced how far they had come. Richard Bennett sat in his luxurious penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly below him. On the surface, his life seemed perfect. He had Vanessa, the woman who made him feel alive again, and a lifestyle filled with luxury and indulgence. But beneath the facade, cracks were beginning to show. Vanessa was everything Richard thought he wanted: glamorous, young, and ambitious. In the early days of their relationship, she had been attentive and charming, the perfect partner to complement his success. But over time, her true nature began to emerge. She became increasingly demanding, and her affection seemed conditional on the gifts and luxurious experiences Richard could provide. At first, Richard dismissed his growing discomfort as paranoia. After all, he had chosen to leave Emily and his child to be with Vanessa. He told himself this was the price of passion, a necessary sacrifice for a new beginning. But the evidence became harder to ignore. Vanessa's late nights, her enigmatic phone calls, the furtive smiles as she glanced at her phone. Each of these moments planted a seed of doubt. One night, while reviewing his company's finances, Richard noticed an inconsistency that sent a chill down his spine. A large sum of money had disappeared from a shared account. He tried to justify it as an accounting error, but something deeply unsettled him. He knew Vanessa had access to that account. Determined to uncover the truth, Richard began tracking Vanessa's movements. He hired a private investigator who, within days, brought irrefutable proof. Photos showed Vanessa entering an expensive restaurant, accompanied by a man Richard recognized immediately, his longtime friend and business partner, Henry Wallace. The images captured complicit smiles, discreet touches, and finally, a kiss that erased any doubt. With the evidence in hand, Richard waited for the right moment to confront her. That night, Vanessa entered the apartment late, wearing the same expensive perfume Richard had gifted her. He was waiting for her in the living room, the documents spread out on the coffee table. "Where were you?" Richard asked, his voice low but heavy with tension. Vanessa hesitated for a second before responding. "Having dinner with a friend." "Why do you ask?" Richard stood slowly, picking up the documents. "A friend? Then explain this." He threw the photos onto the table, one by one, each image more incriminating than the last. Vanessa looked at the photos and, for a brief moment, seemed surprised. But she quickly regained her composure. "So what, Richard? You knew what this was from the start. We both know this was never about love." He was speechless, the shock of her words hitting him like a physical blow. "You're telling me this was all a charade? All this time, you've been using me?" Vanessa crossed her arms, a cold smile forming on her lips. You convinced yourself it was different, but deep down, you always knew. I wanted a life of luxury, and you wanted a young, beautiful woman to show off. We both got what we wanted. Until now. Richard felt a wave of anger rise within him, but also a deep pain he hadn't expected. And Henry? Is he part of your plan too? Vanessa shrugged. Henry is practical. He understands my ambitions and knows how to help me achieve them. Unlike you, who are still clinging to this idea that you're in control. The next day, Richard began to feel the consequences of the betrayal. Vanessa hired skilled lawyers and, with a carefully crafted case, filed for divorce. She claimed psychological abuse and demanded half of his assets, along with a substantial amount in alimony. The scandal spread quickly. Henry, capitalizing on Richard's vulnerability, manipulated the other partners in the company to oust Richard from leadership. Suppliers began to question his management, and investors pulled their support. Within weeks, Richard watched his empire begin to crumble. He moved from a luxurious penthouse to a small rented apartment, far from the circles he once frequented. Former friends vanished, as did the respect he had once prized so highly. For the first time in years, Richard found himself alone, surrounded only by the memories of his choices. One night, sitting in the dim light of his new home, Richard reflected on all he had lost. He picked up an old photo of Emily and stared at it for long minutes. I had everything, he murmured to himself, and I threw it away. The emptiness he felt was overwhelming. But for the first time, he began to realize that his downfall had been inevitable. He had traded a loving family for an illusion, and now he was paying the price. As he gazed out of the window at the city that once seemed to be his, Richard knew he still had much to face. His fall was only the beginning of a long journey to come to terms with the mistakes of his past. The weeks following his downfall were solitary and introspective for Richard. He spent days revisiting the choices that had led him there, living a routine marked by forced simplicity and the absence of the luxuries that had once defined him. Every small noise in his modest apartment reminded him of how far he had fallen. Yet, despite the emptiness, something was slowly growing inside him, a need for redemption. On a rainy afternoon, Richard decided to do something he had avoided for years. He walked to the small park near his old house, where he knew Emily used to take Ethan when he was a child. It wasn't a planned reunion, but rather an impulse, an attempt to connect, even symbolically, with the past he had abandoned. While sitting on a bench, lost in thought, he heard a familiar voice calling, "Richard?" It was Emily, holding an umbrella, with the same resolute gaze from years ago, but now marked by a peace he had never managed to attain. "Emily," he replied, standing slowly. "I didn't expect to see you here." She tilted her head, assessing him. "What are you doing here?" Richard took a deep breath, realizing this moment was an opportunity he couldn't waste. I'm not sure. I think I'm trying to understand what I lost." Emily invited him to walk with her to a small nearby cafe. The setting was simple and cozy, very different from the places Richard used to frequent. As they sipped tea, he finally opened up. He spoke about Vanessa, about Henry, and about how he had lost everything: the company, the money, and his reputation. Emily listened in silence, without interrupting. When he finished, she asked, "And what do you expect now?" Richard looked down at his hands, hesitating before answering. "I don't know, but I wanted to apologize. For everything. For leaving you alone. For abandoning Ethan. I've made more mistakes than I can express." She held her cup delicately, but her voice was firm. "Apologies are a start, Richard, but what matters is what you'll do with them." In the days that followed, Richard tried to build a bridge with Ethan. He knew he couldn't make up for lost time, but he wanted to at least be honest about who he was and the mistakes he had made. Ethan, with the maturity he had inherited from Emily, agreed to hear his biological father, but made it clear that Michael was the man he considered his father. "I don't blame you for trying," Ethan said during one of their meetings. But I want you to know that the man I am today is because of what my mom and Michael did for me. Not you." The words were harsh but fair. Richard accepted them with a nod, realizing that this was the price of his absence. Meanwhile, Emily observed Richard's attempts with a mix of skepticism and hope. She knew he was far from perfect, but she also recognized something genuine in his effort to start over. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she decided to be honest with him. "Richard," she said during a phone call, "you can't erase the past, but that doesn't mean you can't build something new. It's up to you, just like it was up to me when you left me pregnant." Over time, Richard began to find small ways to rebuild his life. He accepted a modest job at a smaller company where no one knew who he was. He discovered a certain peace and simplicity, something he had never valued before. More importantly, he began reconnecting with his humanity, something that luxury and greed had long overshadowed. The reunion with Emily and Ethan wasn't a miracle that fixed everything, but it was a starting point. For Richard, it was the beginning of a new journey, one he knew would require patience, humility, and a determination he barely knew he possessed. And this time, he was willing to face the challenges not with the arrogance of a powerful man, but with the honesty of someone who had learned from his mistakes. Months had passed since Richard began his journey of rebuilding his life. The days were no longer marked by the restless noise of luxury, but by the quiet rhythm of routine. While his circumstances were humble, Richard found himself discovering a deeper sense of fulfillment, a kind of peace that came not from what he owned, but from who he was striving to become. One morning, Richard stood in the mirror, adjusting the tie of his simple work suit. His job at the smaller company wasn't glamorous, but it gave him purpose. As he looked at his reflection, he saw a man who was no longer defined by wealth or reputation, but by determination and resilience. This version of himself, stripped of arrogance, felt oddly freeing. After work, Richard often visited a community center where he had started volunteering. It began as an idea Emily had suggested during one of their rare phone calls. "Maybe helping others will help you," she had said, and she was right. Working with people who had their own stories of struggle and survival gave Richard a perspective he had never had before. One evening, after a particularly long day, Richard received a text message from Ethan. "Are you free this weekend? I have a debate at the university. Thought you might want to come." It was a simple message, but it meant everything to Richard. He replied immediately, confirming that he wouldn't miss it for anything. The following Saturday, he found himself sitting in the university auditorium, surrounded by students and parents. Ethan stood confidently at the podium, presenting his arguments with a poise that made Richard's chest swell with pride. It was the first time he had seen his son in his element, and it was clear that Ethan was everything Richard had hoped he could be, and more. After the debate, Ethan approached Richard, his face unreadable. "Thanks for coming," he said simply. "You were incredible, Ethan," Richard replied, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "I appreciate that." It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was a step. For Richard, it was enough. Meanwhile, Emily observed the slow changes in Richard's life from a distance. She heard about his volunteer work and his efforts to build a relationship with Ethan. While she remained cautious, she couldn't deny that Richard was making progress. Michael, ever supportive, encouraged her to see this as a sign that people can change, even if it took them a lifetime to do so. The most significant moment came during one of Ethan's family dinners. He had invited Richard to join them, a gesture that surprised everyone, including Richard himself. As the evening unfolded, there were moments of tension, but also laughter. Richard found himself sharing stories of his past, not the opulent, embellished ones, but the raw, honest tales of his mistakes and lessons learned. At the end of the night, as Emily walked Richard to the door, she looked at him thoughtfully. "You've come a long way," she admitted. Richard met her gaze, his voice steady. "I have a long way to go, but thank you for everything, for letting me try." Emily smiled faintly. "Keep trying, Richard. That's what matters." Richard left that night with a sense of hope. He knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, but he was no longer running from his past. Instead, he was walking toward a future where his mistakes didn't define him, but serve as a foundation for the man he was becoming. For the first time in years, Richard felt he had found something far more valuable than the wealth he had lost. He had found purpose, connection, and the possibility of redemption. Richard was sitting on a bench in the park where he had often reflected in recent months. It was late afternoon, and the sun, setting on the horizon, painted the sky orange and gold. From a distance, he quietly watched Emily and her family. Michael was talking with Ethan. The scene was perfect, almost like a painting. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He knew that this should have been his place, but he also knew that he had relinquished that role himself. What he saw before him was the result of Emily's choices, building a full and happy life, even after being abandoned. And now, he could only watch from afar, like a spectator of a story that no longer belonged to him. Emily was radiant. Sitting on a picnic blanket, she watched Michael and Ethan competing in a friendly game. Emily smiled to herself, feeling grateful. This was a life she had always dreamed of, surrounded by love, support, and stability. When Michael approached, bringing her a glass of lemonade, she looked at him tenderly. "Thank you for everything, for being you," she said, almost without thinking. Michael smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "You are the reason for all of this, Emily. You turned pain into something incredible." As he watched from a distance, Richard let out a deep sigh. He no longer felt anger or envy. What he felt was a bitter regret mixed with an odd sense of peace. He knew Emily deserved that happiness, and that Michael was the right man for her and Ethan. Richard accepted that his place in that family was no longer as a protagonist, but as a distant bystander. In recent months, he had learned that the consequences of his actions were inescapable. Life didn't forgive his choices, but offered opportunities to learn from them. He had lost almost everything, but ironically, it had helped him find something more valuable: the ability to change. The walk home that evening was slow and full of reflections. Richard thought about the man he had been, and the man he was now striving to be. He knew he would never be able to erase his mistakes, but he also knew they no longer defined him. His journey was no longer about reclaiming the past, but about building something new from the present. Arriving at his modest apartment, he turned on a lamp that bathed the room in a warm light. He sat at his desk, where he kept a journal. It was there he wrote his daily reflections, a habit that helped him stay focused on progress. That night, he wrote, "Life has given me many chances, and I squandered almost all of them. But now I understand that regret isn't the end, it's a starting point. Today, I saw what my life could have been, and though it hurts to accept, it's also a reminder that I can still do something good with the time I have left." Emily, on the other hand, ended that day in peace. Lying next to Michael, she felt that she had reached the destination she had always desired. She looked out the window at the starry sky and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. Her journey had been full of challenges, but each one had led her to something better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.